Then we move over to these two Upper Ridge paintings, Upper Ridge in Snow and Upper Ridge in, what are they called? Upper Ridge at Dusk and Upper Ridge in Snow. Now, here is the source photo. And you can see that actually in all of these paintings where I have the large source photo, the final painting is just a little extract of that. That's something we call limited focus. And a limited focus is like the first act of simplification. It's the first act of composition. We determine what is not going to be included. We determine what's going to help make our composition simple and what's going to focus the composition. So here, just by picking that section, I found a very interesting, what I thought was a very interesting composition. Some really interesting shapes that moved and that stepped me back into space at the same time, which is always desirable. Here again is a picture of this painting, 2 hours old or 3 hours old. And again, if I'm doing my job, I'm building and establishing good shapes from the outset. And then this painting was working really well. And I don't usually do this, but I said, I'm satisfied with this composition enough that I want to try it again. And I'll try it again with a different palette. And so I created this one, which is at dusk. The challenge in these two paintings is a little similar to the Pinnacle Peak painting, which, as you recall, had this flat quality to it, which sort of went against my desire to make it spatial. And now these, basically, there's positive, meaning the solid rocks, and then there's negative, the flat snow and the sky. And I include the snow and the sky as the same negative because they're the same value. And what I did not want to happen, and this is a little bit of an insight into the way we think about colors, is that I didn't want these dark shapes to feel like pockets, like holes. They're rocks. They're sitting in front of the snow, or at least on the same level as the snow. So through texture and color, I alter them until they just sit a little bit forward of the snow. And in this painting, if you come up, and you can probably see it from where you are, there's almost ochre-y colors in there. And although I imagine the rocks as this kind of cool blue-gray, when they were cool blue-gray, they were creating pockets. And they were like little holes. And that went against what I wanted to do spatially. So I began to build up these warmer ochre-y greens. And I would say I spent the last third or last half of the time on this painting noodling that subtle color control. Any questions about these?
It seems like you would have grappled with the color even more on the sunset one, or the one with all the...
It actually is a bit surprising that this higher key lavender and pink don't jump forward, don't come forward more than they do. I think it probably has to do simply with the fact that it's much smoother and it's unvariegated. Whereas this stuff is much more active. Wherever the surface is active with texture or small strokes or vigorous strokes, again, it's just going to get more notice. Just like if somebody's talking really fast or really loud, you're going to notice them more than someone who's talking very softly. I think you're headed to this one's more neutral, and this one's slightly more intense, although this isn't highly intense. It gets fairly intense over here, but it is a little bit muted. So when you say, am I thinking about neutral versus bright, that's something that I think about at the beginning, whether I'm creating a color scheme that is going to be based on fairly high-key colors, or it's a color strategy that's going to be working with neutrals. Now, neutrals, a lot of painters don't really think of neutrals as a color strategy. They just think it's neutral color, something they use. They think of complementary colors or split complements or analogous as color strategies. But actually, getting all your colors to be fairly neutral is a way of binding those colors together. So I actually have treated a number of paintings with neutrals and created kind of a unifying effect. Is that get close to answering your question?
Yes, I was just curious, what your thought processes are.
Okay, good. All right, let's move on to these smaller pieces. This photograph was the source, if you could call it that, for this painting. And I think you can make out the little line. It's just this tiny little section. This is like extreme, extreme limited focus. But you can never know where you're going to find something interesting. It's all about the shapes. When I sign my books, I always write to everybody, remember, it's all about the shapes, one beautiful shape after another. And I really believe that. It's also about lots of beautiful colors, one beautiful color after another. But the shapes are really, really important because we hinge the color onto the shapes. And so we want to get those shapes as sound as possible. If I have this great photograph or this wonderful study that's all perfed out and just the way I want it, well, I don't need to do a painting, do I? If the painting's not going to take me somewhere, or actually take you somewhere, actually take you to where it took me, if it's not going to do that in a way that the photograph couldn't do it, then why do the painting? I mean, the painting, I always say if paintings weren't doing something that photographs couldn't do, we would have all been put out of business 150 years ago when the camera came out. So there's definitely something we're bringing to this mix that's beyond simple picture recording. But in the final painting, I brought yet more color into it because snow, you want it to be warm, right? But you don't want to make it all yellow because that's kind of weird. And that was the challenge in the Pinnacle Peak painting because that's kind of whitish, but there's a little bit of yellow in there, there's a little bit of blue in there. And that was the secret, that if I made it strictly yellow, it would be like, what's with the weird yellow snow? As a matter of fact, one of my colleagues / friend artists was looking at this painting and when it was close to being done, and she said, that yellow snow, it's just weird. And I said, you're right, it is weird. So as soon as she left, I cranked out the paints and I changed it, and it got a lot better. Which is just, by the way, advice to the artists here. Always, listen to your other artist friends and get advice from other smart eyes. It's really an important thing. You don't want to work in a vacuum. Question, yes?
Do you still paint a lot in the colors?
That's a very good question, too. I would say I'm one of the landscape painters who, these days, most of my work comes out of the studio, but I still paint outside every season, and I've been painting outside for 25 years, so there is a lot of information that I gather. I believe that you need to do that homework. There's kind of a thing that you get from the one-to-one relationship with nature. Just how do those colors in reality translate into paint? Because it's not a one-to-one relationship, and that's that magical thing that I was talking about earlier. You cannot mimic nature. You can't just say, well, that's a blue sky and put the same blue down, or that's a green tree and put the same green tree down. Most of you here are painters, but if you're not, if you try that, it doesn't work. You have to figure out something else, some combination of color and value. So I'm a big believer that, like, getting back to your roots, so to speak, happens in plein air. That's what we call painting outdoors. And there's a lot of good training for translating light into pigment. I don't just mean light into color, but light into pigment. Okay, good.